Thanks, Henry. Yeah, so as Henry sort of mentioned, this is a project I'm doing that looks at past cases where friends or U.S. allies or partners acquired nuclear weapons to see what kind of lessons we can glean about potential future cases. And the impetus, Henry was saying, was sort of this debate that happens especially most publicly among academics and think tankers, but also behind the scenes among U.S. policymakers about what impact friends getting nuclear weapons has on U.S. security. So on one side of the debate, we have what I call the nuclear optimists. In the most pure form, they argue that nuclear weapons deter conflict, so the more countries with secure second strike capabilities, the less war there'll be. Relatedly, if U.S. allies and partners can protect themselves with nuclear weapons, the U.S. can reduce its defense spending, reduce its commitments abroad, and won't get entangled in wars it doesn't want to fight. There's also, they're not really optimists, I call them fatalists, people that argue that we don't necessarily want our allies and partners to get nuclear weapons, but it's inevitable that they're gonna, and it's not that bad, it's manageable. And also, an argument is we don't want them to get nuclear weapons, but it's not an issue worth straining the alliance over trying to stop them if they really want to get them. On the other side, the pessimists, they make arguments like the more countries that have nuclear weapons, the greater chance is that one or two of these are going to be used at some point. Another popular one is proliferation begets proliferation. Once a country gets nuclear weapons, its neighbors or its enemies want to get them as well. And then also, if allies have nuclear weapons, they'll be less dependent on the United States. They'll be able to act with more autonomy and possibly more aggressively. And just sort of to show the unsettled nature of this debate, you can look at none other than President Trump, who as a candidate seemed to take both sides of the debate at different times. So the issue, I think, with this debate is it's too abstract and theoretical, which might have made sense, a few decades ago, but now we have a bunch of concrete cases like Britain, France, Pakistan, and Israel, and we can look at those and see what happened in those cases to discern what might happen in future cases. So today I'm going to briefly go through each of these cases, and to make it not too abstract and theoretical, I'm going to focus specifically on lessons I think that most apply to potential future cases. For Britain and France, I'm going to look at how these lessons might apply to a country like South Korea. And then for Israel and Pakistan, I'm going to focus on how these lessons might apply to a country like Saudi Arabia. Before getting into cases, I just want to have a quick caveat. This is a quote from Henry Kissinger about learning from history. I think history is a great tool to learn from, but it's not exact science. No two cases are exactly alike. I think it's best used more as to see what the range of outcomes that might happen and the type of issues that might come up in future cases of allies and partners getting nuclear weapons. So the first case I'm going to look at is Britain. The conventional wisdom on Britain is everything was honky-dory. Britain helped us build the bomb during the Manhattan Project, and then after the war we helped Britain get the bomb, and it was all great. And when you actually look at the history, this is not the case at all. After the war, Britain and the United States were growing closer on basically every issue, except for nuclear cooperation, which really strained the alliance. In fact, there was at one point the Truman administration had to talk down some Congress members that wanted to withhold aid for Britain over this nuclear cooperation. So it really was a strain on the alliance. And the origins of the post-World War II friction dates to their cooperation during World War II. Well, it's true that Britain scientists did join the Manhattan Project. This was almost entirely due to FDR. Most of his advisors actually opposed bringing Britain on board. He overruled them. He signs a number of agreements with Churchill. The two most important are the Quebec Agreement. That was the one where Britain says it's going to end its national program and come help out on the Manhattan Project. And then I think more importantly for our purposes is the Hyde Park Aid Memoir, which is where FDR and Churchill signed an agreement that says the Britain and the U.S. will continue their nuclear cooperation once the war is over. What's interesting about this agreement is FDR tells almost no one about it on the U.S. side. They only find out about it once he passes away and the British bring it up. And in fact, the Americans couldn't even find FDR's copy of the agreement until 1957. So what this means is that after the war ends, Britain thinks Americans are going to continue this nuclear cooperation and help them build the bomb. And the Americans say, no thanks, our agreement ended when the war was over. So here's a number of the issues that the Americans had towards the British nuclear program. I'm not going to go through all of them, and hopefully you can see them, but I do want to focus on two. The one is the vulnerability issue. Once Britain announces in 1947 it's going to build a bomb, the Americans become terrified that nuclear facilities and eventual bomb in the British Isles are going to be either targeted by the Soviet Union or worse yet, they'll be seized by the Soviets in the event of invasion and then used to enhance their arsenal. So they actually go through pretty great lengths to try to get Britain not to build the program, especially on the British Isles. They even offer to help the British with the bomb if they agree to locate all the facilities in Canada, not not in the British Isles, and England says no thanks. The other issue is launch control, and this really goes to how you operationalize nuclear arsenals within the context of an alliance. And once again, the tensions over this issue date back to the World War II cooperation, because one clause of the Quebec Agreement was neither side would use nuclear weapons against a third party without the other side's agreement. And once the war is over, the Americans desperately want to annul this clause because they don't want to inhibit the president's freedom of action to use nuclear weapons. So they put pressure on the British, and eventually in 1948, the British agreed to eliminate that clause. The following year, the Berlin blockade happens, and during it, the British allowed the Americans to forward deploy bombers to Britain. It's only after those bombers arrive that they begin to ask questions. They begin to think through the implications of this and ask questions like, what can the Americans use these bombers to attack the Soviet Union without getting the Britain's agreement? Which they would say, sure we can. And to the Americans' credit, we began to anticipate the issues that Britain's nuclear program could have for the alliance before England actually explodes the bomb. One example is there's a July 1949 meeting between the Truman administration and Congress. And in the meeting, one senator wonders if Britain gets the bomb, could it stay neutral in the war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? A few minutes later, a congressman worries that when Britain gets the bomb, it's actually going to start a war with the Soviet Union. It's going to entangle the United States. So they began thinking through these launch control issues. In the end, in 1962, Britain agrees that its nuclear arsenal will be under NATO command with two important caveats. One, only the British Prime Minister can authorize the use of any of the British nuclear weapons, and two, Britain withholds the right to use these weapons outside of the NATO alliance. So, well, they're not only under NATO command for all intents and purposes, they're actually a British nuclear arsenal, or national arsenal. So the reason why I focus on these two issues is because I think they have some lessons for South Korea. With the vulnerability issue, one of the reasons we pulled out our own nuclear weapons from South Korea after the Cold War ended was because they were kind of a pain in the ass to protect, and they were more trouble than they were worth. And so if South Korea builds nuclear weapons, how do you protect those from North Korean first strikes or Chinese first strikes? And I think the launch control issue is even more relevant. I actually think you're already seeing this launch control issues develop in the U.S. ROC alliance, but they've become more intense with nuclear weapons. We've seen President Moon, for instance, in recent months say the U.S. cannot attack North Korea without South Korea's permission. At the same time, South Korea is acquiring the missile command and control and ISR capabilities to implement what it calls its kill chain doctrine, and that envisions South Korea launching preemptive strikes against North Korea's nuclear and missile facilities, and also its senior leadership, trying to take out Kim Jong-un and the senior leadership. And of course, if they carried out any of these attacks, we have 28,000 troops on the peninsula, and we'd be caught up in any of the retaliation that North Korea brought upon South Korea. So the question becomes, what say do we have in launching these attacks? So those are the main lessons for Britain. To the French case, when most people think about France and nuclear weapons, they think about Charles de Gaulle, but actually most of the major decisions to put France on the path to acquiring nuclear weapons happened during the Fourth Republic when de Gaulle was out of power. What's notable about this is the Fourth Republic French leaders actually viewed nuclear weapons very similar to their British counterparts. They thought if France gets nuclear weapons, we'll increase our influence with the Americans within NATO, but ultimately they'll be part of the NATO command, or at least, adding to the arsenal. And what ends up happening is before France explodes its first bomb, de Gaulle returns to power, and he has very different views on things like alliances and France's position in the world. He doesn't care for alliances very much. He wants France to maintain its independence, and he also thinks France should be at the table with the superpowers because it's its natural role. And these views all existed from at least as far back as World War II when he was in exile living in Britain. The bomb didn't make these views. What they did is allow him to act on them. And this is most notable once France gets its first leg of its nuclear triad, the Mirage planes. De Gaulle tells NATO has to move all its bases and personnel out of French territory, and France is leaving NATO command. So I think some people would see this and think this is great news for future cases, because if the main issues with France's bomb had to do with Charles de Gaulle, well, Charles de Gaulle doesn't run South Korea, he doesn't run Japan or Saudi Arabia. I think that's a wrong lesson. I think the point here is we can't control who runs these countries now or in the future. And even if, say, a South Korean leader that starts a nuclear weapons program but is very much in favor of the American alliance, there's no guarantee that his successors won't be a nationalist leader like de Gaulle and could use the nuclear weapons he inherits to act like de Gaulle did. Here's some other U.S. concerns the U.S. had regarding France's nuclear program. I'm again not going to go through all of them. I do want to highlight the Germany issue. It's hard to overstate how much U.S. policymakers viewed the French nuclear program through the lens of West Germany. It said that NATO was created to keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. And American leaders believed that if West Germany got nuclear weapons, the Germans would no longer be down, the Western alliance would be destroyed, and antagonize the Soviet Union, possibly start a war. And of course, they felt that if France gets nuclear weapons, there's no way we're going to be able to stop the West Germans from doing so. So that's really one of their main concerns when France is pursuing the bomb. Of course, we were successful in stopping West Germany. Here's some consequences of France getting the bomb. Again, I don't want to highlight all of them, but I want to go through two. This independent nuclear decision-making, this again goes to the issue of how do you operationalize a nuclear arsenal within the context of an alliance, and it applies to France and Britain. But what I basically mean here is that when JFK comes to power, he implements or adopts this flexible response military strategy, which basically envisioned controlled, gradual escalation in the event of a conflict with the Soviet Union. So, you start off with conventional forces, and if we start losing, we might use a tactical nuclear weapon or two in an attempt to escalate to de-escalate, as the Russians maybe have a strategy now. And what they McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and JFK administration more broadly quickly realized is implementing the strategies becomes very difficult when you have these independent nuclear decision makers in Paris and London, because while Americans might withhold a lot of their arsenal or all of it, there's nothing to stop the British or the French from just launching bombs at the Soviet Union. And I don't want to get into was flexible response a good idea or a bad idea. But even if you think it was a terrible idea, I think the main issue for future cases is that these independent arsenals inhibited the U.S. from pursuing the kind of defense strategies it wanted to do. And there's no guarantee they won't in the future, even if they're good defense strategies. The other issue is this nuclear supply proliferation chain. I mentioned that the pessimists worry that if a country gets nuclear weapons, its neighbors and enemies will build the bomb to protect themselves from it. You don't really see this with any of the cases I studied. What you do see in some of them, including France, is that the new nuclear powers begin spreading nuclear technology, which allows other countries to get the bomb. These are a list of cases that either France sold nuclear technology to or was going to, and the U.S. intervened. The big one, I think, is Israel. To enlist Israel's help in what became the Suez Crisis, France offers Israel basically a starter kit for making nuclear bombs, plutonium producing a reactor and a reprocessing plant to separate plutonium to build the nuclear weapons. And without that, Israel couldn't have gotten nuclear weapons anywhere near as soon as it did, and it's possible maybe it never would, given that later on the NPT comes into force. So lessons for South Korea, again, how do you operationalize a second arsenal within the context of the alliance? Just as West Germany was central to U.S. policymakers for the French case, I think a country like Japan would be central for if South Korea got the bomb. As much as China would not like South Korea getting nuclear weapons, I think it would be at a whole different level in terms of its opposition to Japan and certainly Taiwan getting nuclear weapons. So that would be a main concern to the U.S. policymakers if South Korea went nuclear. We were able to stop the West Germans from doing so, from following suit, but could we stop Japan or Taiwan? Open question. Then, of course, the big one is what if a nationalistic South Korean leader comes into power and kicks the U.S. out of its country? And I want to highlight an important difference here, and that is, although when Gaulle kicked NATO out of France, it was a major crisis at the time. It took place in the context of a multilateral alliance. So ultimately, we can move those bases and personnel to different countries within NATO. That doesn't exist in Asia today. So if South Korea kicked the U.S. out of the country, where do we go? Is there, will someone else take us in? It's not as easy as even the French case was. So I think it'd be a major problem for U.S. policymakers. Then I also want to highlight a wrong lesson for South Korea briefly. One of the famous quotes you hear is de Gaulle explaining why France had get nuclear weapons, and he said, once the Soviet Union had ICBMs and could attack the U.S. with nuclear weapons, France couldn't rely on America being willing to trade New York for Paris. And you hear this a lot now, brought up in the context of North Korea getting ICBMs. Will South Korean leaders believe that America will trade Seoul or San Francisco for Seoul or whatever? I'm not saying this concern isn't valid to some degree, but I think you got to highlight the context here. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union possessed overwhelming conventional superiority over NATO, and NATO tried to offset that by using tactical nuclear weapons against the Soviet divisions to blunt their attack. And what de Gaulle was worried about was not that the Soviet Union would nuke Paris if they didn't believe Americans would trade New York or something. What he was worried is that the Soviet Union would invade Western Europe, and the U.S. wouldn't use tactical nuclear weapons against the Soviet divisions out of fear that Moscow would respond by nuking U.S. cities, and so that Soviet Union would be able to conquer Western Europe. And obviously the difference with in Korea today is that the U.S. rocket alliance could defeat the conventional North Korean invasion, which wasn't the case in the Cold War, so it's an important difference here. So turning to the Israel case, the Israel case is by far the most frustrating to try to wrap your hands around, partly because neither the U.S. or Israel acknowledges the existence of the bomb, and also because the unique nature of the U.S.-Israel alliance, or not even alliance, friendship, I guess. So it's actually really difficult to even draw concrete conclusions about the Israel case, much less figure out lessons for other cases. But I guess we'll try. Just to highlight what a beautiful, dark, twisted mess this whole thing is point to Abe Feinberg. Now, Abe Feinberg is a prominent Jewish American business leader who becomes a prominent Democratic fundraiser. He actually plays a critical role in getting Truman reelected through raising funds, and that endears him to the Democratic Party in the United States. He also is very close to a lot of the Israeli leaders. After World War II ended, he actually helped smuggle people and weapons to what was then British Palestine to enable the Jewish freedom fighters there, Jewish leaders there, to establish their own state. And in doing so, he meets a lot of the future Israeli leaders, including the Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion. And when France offers Ben-Gurion and Israel this amazing deal to buy a reactor and a reprocessing plant, Ben-Gurion realizes this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But the problem is Israel's a really poor country and can't afford to pay for this technology. So what does Ben-Gurion do? He calls Abe. Abe Feinberg gets together some of his closest millionaire friends, and they raise $20 million. And this is really to help Israel buy the French reactor and reprocessing plant. And this, most authors believe, without that money, Israel probably couldn't have afforded it. Now, the Americans discover that France is building this reactor in the Israeli desert in the waning days of the Eisenhower administration, so it becomes one of the first issues JFK has to deal with, and what they want to do is get American inspectors to visit the plant to confirm that it's for peaceful purposes, like Israel is saying, and so they can reassure the Arabs and the Soviets. And for obvious reasons, the Israelis are not thrilled about that idea of having Americans walking around this plant where they might discover something like the reprocessing plant that Israel says it's not building. So they stonewall JFK. So JFK gets frustrated, and what does he do? He says, call Abe. And he gets Abe Feinberg and says, can you go get Ben-Gurion to allow us to have these inspections, which to his credit, Abe Feinberg does. But throughout the rest of the JFK and LBJ administrations, Abe Feinberg is like a key unofficial advisor to the U.S. presidents when it comes to Israel. So this, I just think, encapsulates what a unique case this is, where this guy is the one point funding the Israeli nuclear program, on the other hand, helping the U.S. Deal with the diplomacy about it. So anyways, some of the U.S. concerns, one of the big ones was if Israel gets a bomb, there's no way the Arab states won't follow suit. Also, they were worried that maybe instead of getting their own bombs, what the Arab states would do was ask the Soviet Union to increase its presence in the region, perhaps even forward deploy nuclear weapons to the region and thereby increase Soviet influence in the Middle East. And I think an interesting one too is they were worried that if it was seen that the U.S. failed to stop Israel from getting nuclear weapons, the U.S. credibility with the Arab states would be destroyed. They'd say, what good are you if you can't stop Israel from getting nuclear weapons? So again, like I said, even just finding concrete consequences of the Israel program is somewhat difficult. One clear one is what I call alternative facts, which is basically, to this very day, the U.S. policymakers have to distort the truth about Israel's nuclear program to the public, to Congress, to other countries. It's hard to quantify what the cost is of this, but I think there is some cost there. More interesting one is, I think, the qualitative military edge. Before Israel gets nuclear weapons, U.S. policymakers do not want to sell Israel military supplies directly for fear of antagonizing the Arab countries. And also, even when they talk about that, they talk about doing so, they talk about maintaining a balance between the Israelis and the Arab countries. And it seems clear at first that when Israel's on the verge of getting nuclear weapons, they begin to take a different view. They have to ensure that Israel can defend itself conventionally, because if it fails to do so, it'll turn to nuclear weapons. So that's really, I think, where this qualitative military edge, as we call it today, first comes from. Now it's being sustained because of other factors too, but I just think it's interesting that was really where it first developed. Here's a bunch of issues, which I'm not going to go all through, about Israel. There's some evidence to say that Israel nuclear weapons might have played a role in, but it's hard to say for sure. The Yom Kippur War is interesting. There's been this long-standing rumor that when Israel was about to be defeated in the Yom Kippur War, it armed its Jericho missiles with nuclear warheads in a way that the U.S. could see to sort of blackmail the U.S. into resupplying it. It's still not 100% clear if this happened. It seems more likely that it didn't. But even if it didn't happen, it did have a consequence because apartheid South African leaders saw this or believed the rumor, and they said, we should get our own nuclear weapons because if we're ever about to be destroyed, we can blackmail Americans into saving us, just like they did with the Israelis. I think more generally, with the Yom Kippur War, is the Americans were conscious that Israel had these nuclear weapons, and if they were about to be destroyed, they might use them. So while there's not concrete evidence, I think this did play a role in America resupplying Israel during the war to some degree, and of course that had huge costs in terms of the Arab oil embargo that followed. But another quick one I want to highlight is I was talking to a former very senior U.S. official, and he said in his belief the fact that Israel has these nuclear weapons to defend themselves makes them more comfortable with defying the international community on things like settlements, which he believes they wouldn't do if they didn't have these nuclear weapons. I don't know if that's true, but I just thought it was an interesting thing to highlight. So turning to lessons for Saudi Arabia, nuclearized Middle East, just as we feared the Arab states were getting nuclear weapons. If Israel did, I'm sure there'd be concerns that Saudi Arabia gets the bomb. Certainly maybe not the Arab states, but certainly Iran and possibly Turkey follows suit. Again, it didn't happen in the Israel case. Would it happen in the future? Hard to say. Saudi Arabia might be emboldened, again. And then reduce U.S. credibility. If U.S. can't even stop one of its closest partners in the Middle East from getting the nuclear weapons, how much credibility does it really have? So moving on to the Pakistan case, which I'm calling the case from hell. Jeffrey Goldberg had this popular article about Pakistan a few years back, called it the ally from hell, and I shamelessly stole it. That because this case really is the worst of all scenarios, basically across the board. U.S. concerns when Pakistan started pursuing nuclear weapons. The main one was, India had done this peaceful nuclear test in 1974, but it hadn't actually built an arsenal, and they were like, if Pakistan gets nuclear weapons, there's no way India's not going to weaponize this capability, and that could strain the crisis between the two countries. And then also even from an early time, they worried that Pakistan was going to sell its nuclear technology to other countries, which could be a huge problem for the U.S. And they were right on both counts, basically. So I'm not going to go through all these again. But I do want to focus on nuclear proliferation undermines geopolitics. What I mean by this is the fact that Pakistan was first pursuing and acquired nuclear weapons really made it more difficult for the U.S. to achieve its objectives in South Asia. During the 1980s, the U.S. wanted to fight this proxy war with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, and to do so, the Reagan administration really had to walk a careful balancing act to ensure Congress would continue giving aid to Pakistan, which it wouldn't do if they said Pakistan had nuclear weapons, even though, by the middle of the decade or so, basically, for all intents and purposes, did. So it's, again, some alternative facts. More importantly, after 9/11, I've talked to some U.S. policymakers who were involved in this area in the Obama and Bush administration. The U.S. wants to pursue this global war on terror, and I think to some extent, America's ability to prosecute this war, go after these terrorists, was inhibited by the fact that Pakistan had nuclear weapons, because every policy had to be seen through the lens of, will destabilize Pakistan. We can't have Pakistan, the government falling, to create loose nukes, and we don't want terrorists to get nuclear weapons. So it did, in some level, constrain what we could do in prosecuting the war on terror, because we always had to think, how does this impact Pakistan and its nuclear weapons? I want to also highlight increased U.S. engagement. As I said at the beginning, the optimists say if our friends get nuclear weapons, we can reduce our engagement there. And at least in this case, especially, that is not the case at all. India and Pakistan fought 3 wars before they got nuclear weapons, and it wasn't that the U.S. didn't care about them at all, but it was, a very low-level secondary issue, pretty much. But once the Indo-Pakistani dispute goes nuclear, every time there's even a crisis, it becomes a major concern for the U.S. policymakers because of its potential to escalate to the nuclear level. So the first crisis in the nuclear era was 1990 and 1991, and this is the first time the U.S. actually the president sends an envoy to talk both sides back from the brink. It was Robert Gates in that case. And actually the deputy director of the CIA at the time is Dick Kerr during this 1990-1991 crisis, and he said about it, actually just get the exact quote, he said, quote, "It was far more frightening than the Cuban Missile Crisis," and he was actually in government for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is actually kind of a smaller dispute in the grand scheme of India-Pakistan disputes. So that is a huge cost, I think. The loose nukes issue is pretty well understood, I think. And then the nuclear proliferation chain, again, like France, Pakistan sold nuclear technology, or tried to in the case of Iraq, to other countries to help them build nuclear weapons. And in this case, we're not talking about a country like Israel that has friendly relations with the US. We're talking about a who's who of countries that are America's adversaries. I'm not going to focus this on too much because I think most people know about that whole thing. So lessons for Saudi Arabia, the nukes issue, I don't know if anyone's noticed, but Saudi Arabia is not like the poster child of a modern 21st century country. Yeah, so if, Saudi Arabia gets these bombs and then falls apart at some point, which seems like at least a possibility, I think that, that would be a huge issue. And, well, it's not the haven for terrorists that Pakistan is. There's the potential for Saudi generals or scientists to sympathize with fundamentalist groups and perhaps give them nuclear weapons or fissile material. Nuclear proliferation undermines geopolitics. Again, people probably noticed that over the last 20 years or so, the U.S. hasn't been very good at achieving its objectives in the Middle East. But if Saudi Arabia and Iran get nuclear weapons, does that become easier or harder to do? I think harder, and we're starting from a low base already. And then the big one, I think, is the Iran-Saudi Arabia proxy war. Obviously, we're already very concerned about these proxy wars in Syria and Yemen. What about if you add the nuclear dimension to it? Is it, it's going to become a way bigger concern. If we start bombing Iranian, if Saudi Arabia bombed Iranian advisors in Yemen, does that escalate to nuclear war? So just like with the India-Pakistan case, I think that would make it a lot more important. U.S. policymakers have to devote a lot more resources and time to dealing with than we do today. That, I think, is the end.